Hello CIS27. In this video I will go over Unit 3 Lab, in which we will be implementing security protocols in our configuration. On the lab page, it gives you the general instruction how to use the practice lab by clicking the link. The practice lab does periodically update your grades, so if you pause it in the middle, it will give you the partial credit until you complete. When you complete, you need to click the done button, so that way it will give you the completion score, which is 100%. If you don't complete the practice lab will give you the partial credit. So make sure that you complete the lab and click done. So in practice lab, once you click the link, you will find practice lab instructions, and in this lab we will be completing 3 exercises. The first exercise, we are going to work with DNSSEC, Domain Name System Security Extension. The second lab, we will set up Virtual Private Network using IPSec. The third lab, we will go over security protocols. So in each portion of the lab, it gives you the details and the instructions, so make sure you follow it. So to begin, it explains the module in which you will be setting up zones for DNS and working with the DNSSEC, especially with the group policy object. Second, you will be working with various protocol and services, including the mail exchanger, SMIME, your SRTP, as we explained that in our lecture, along with LDAP with the Active Directory, and some additional protocol that would relate to encryption and email, such as POP, IMAP. Now this lab is expected to last about an hour. If you take a little bit longer, that will be fine. So you can take your time throughout the lab. When you click next, on the second page, it gives you the topology for practice lab virtual machines, which is located in the middle. It would launch the first virtual machine, which is the server, but there will be time that they will ask you to turn on the second or the third virtual machine, in that you have 2 server and a Windows 10. Lastly, Kali Linux is not being used in this lab. So when you go to the next page, you will begin exercise 1. And in this exercise, it works with Domain Name System Security Extension. DNS is used for domains, so all the system that is connected to the network, it needs to be joined to the domain name system. The server recognizes the workgroup computer or the computer that's joining the network by either IP address or host name. And what it's doing is it's converting the domain name to an IP address, which is providing service to the rest of the system, or it can also allow reverse lookup from an IP address to the domain name, such as google.com, msn.com, etc. So in the first part, you will need to power on the 3 virtual machines. The first one is going to be Windows Server 2019. It is the domain controller that will be the parent server system. The second system that you need to turn on is the BDM01. So we will need to click power on BDM01, and it might take a few minutes to do so. The third system that we need is your client system, which is your domain member Windows 10. So along with the second server, we need to power on Windows 10. Once you power that on, you can go over the instruction. And in task 1, it explains DNS zone. In the root domain, it's going to start with the DNS namespace. So we would see something like, let's say we have google.com. So .com is going to be the root and Google is going to be the domain name. Now every domain would have specific zone, in that each zone gives you the control over how you want your domain to be utilized. A zone can be created with the forward lookup zone or the reverse lookup zone. A forward lookup zone is when it would contain the host name, which is your computer name or your server name, to an IP address mapping. So in the case where we have a domain name system, such as google.com, that name is mapped to an address that's assigned for that particular server. So when a client system like a Windows 10 joining a network or a domain, it needs to be able to search for that domain name or the host name, such as google.com. Or it can search by using IP address, such as 17.5.8.0, for example. So now we would start with using the server 2019 lab BDC01. And for this one, we're going to set up our domain to be Secure Practice Lab. So on this server, if you have that powered on, you would see that it would take you to the server manager. Now when we refer to Practice Lab, the next step is for us to get to Tools and to select DNS. Now this is a role in the server system. So when you click on the server, you would go to Tools. And if the role is installed, this is installed, which is DNS, we would be able to see that on the Tools menu. Now installing the role does not mean that the role is configured. So after we do the installation of the DNS, we would then click on its role and to be able to set up the zone. In order to add the role to the server, you can see that the server manager has this roles and features, so you can click add roles and feature for the necessary role that you need. So on a server environment for Windows, if you wanted to see which role is installed, you would click Tools and you would see the role listed, and if you need to add the roles, you can simply click add roles, or if you need to add features, you would be able to select the features. So now after we have the role installed, we would then go to the DNS. And here you would see that this is the server system name, not the domain name. And in it, with that role, there is a folder for forward lookup zone and reverse lookup zone. Normally in a network environment, you would see that there's forward lookup zone primarily, so it would be able to map the domain name, such as practicelab.com, to the IP address of that server. At this point, after you click the DNS, what you would need to do is refer to the next step, where you would click forward lookup zone folder like I showed you. Then you're going to right click and create a new zone. After you create a new zone, you will be able to set up using the wizard. So going back to the server, what we see is once we click on the forward lookup zone, we can right click it and choose a new zone. Here is the wizard, and Microsoft is pretty good at giving you the step-by-step instruction in that it walks you through using a wizard. So if we click next, now to start, if you don't have a zone set up, as it is a brand new server with a brand new DNS role, we would want to set up a primary zone. If you wanted to copy a zone from another server, let's say you already have a primary server and you wanted to have an additional zone, then you would select the secondary, and here it gives you each of the zone information. So for the third zone, that will be stub zone, and that would create a copy of the zone containing the NS and the SOA. But for most part, when we configure, we would use the primary zone. Unless you have a secondary server, then you would need to copy the zone over. So when we refer back to Practice Lab, it explains how you would be using the primary zone. And you would select the store zone in Active Directory. Recall in the last lab I mentioned that you often find DNS working directly with Active Directory. And Active Directory allows us to keep a database of users, groups, systems, computers, and objects that will be accessing our network. So in order to be effectively implementing the server system, we need to make sure that we set up our DNS, and we wanted to use our DNS with Active Directory. So after you have selected the Store the Zone for Active Directory checkbox is selected on the wizard, then you would set up the Active Directory replication scope. Now, the way that we have for step 5 here is that the selection is going to go to all the DNS server running on the domain controllers under this domain, practicelab.com. So when you select that option, what that does is it's going to replicate across any of the sub or the child domains or any of the additional DNS that's connected under Practice Lab. Meaning that if you have practicelab.com, if you have a child server that's under that domain, we can replicate the rules, the configuration to pass on to the next server that's also connecting in our domain. The whole point is to have a hierarchical structure, so that way once you configure the parent domain, you can carry the configuration to the additional domain that's under that particular parent. So what we have here is we would have a replication of scope that allows us to replicate the configuration from one server to another, but we would have to sync and set up the replication. Now, when you go through, it tells you to create a new zone, and you would name it securepracticelab.com. So at this point, what we would have is we would set up under the parent secure as part of the practicelab.com. Then we're going to click next. So when we give it a name, we're going to allow it to dynamically update and allow only secure dynamic updates. So what that does is it's going to take Active Directory information and for the integrated zone, and it's going to periodically update using secure connection. And it's important that we select the appropriate options for the update, as you would have another option where you would allow it to update using non-secure connection, where there would be less security in the communication across the servers. So under Wizard, it also gives you the explanation, a brief explanation of each option on how you would set that up. Once you complete the zone wizard, you would be able to see that as in the right panel for your zone. So coming back to our practice lab, after we set up the zone, we would then proceed to configure your IPSec. But in the completion of the setting up the zone, you need to also implement the policy. So the point in setting up zone is to implement rules with the zone and how we wanted to control those rules. In prior steps after you set up your zone, you would then, let me take you back here. You would be signing the zone and then you would click finish. Now the DNS manager, it's going to show up under the zone that you would have set up, which is securepracticelab.com. And at this point, what we can do is we can set up the records, such as hosts, records for the DNS, and implementing DNSSEC. Now, DNSSEC is going to be a better option than what we originally have for the DNS. In that it would be allowing us to implement the security requirement with the policies. Once you set up your DNS zone, you would see that here, and you can always access its properties. And in its property, you can always make configuration or changes as needed. So if you didn't select the right options in the wizard, you can always go into the properties of that particular zone and be able to change. So for example, I can change this to a different type of zone if I need to. And of course, once the change takes effect, it would give you additional message and requirement for other changes. And in the replication, as you selected earlier, you can change it across or the options that's needed. So following along with the lab, you can make appropriate configuration by selecting the options. Now, in the security options, you would see that who would have permissions that's allowed to view or have full control in certain areas, so everyone's able to view the zone, whereas DNS admin would have allowed additional options there. On the general tab, like we saw, we can stop it from running by clicking pause. We can also take a look at the aging of our zone and how we would set up the zone transfer if you wanted to allow the zone transfer or not. I think in the lab it briefly walk you through the wizard, and then later on it would have you work with PowerShell in order to set up your proper zone. The name server, it's going to pinpoint the actual domain, which is practicelab.com, and here is the name of our server, which is labbdc01. Now, for additional start your SOA records, you can have it refresh across your primary server in a certain interval and certain attempt, and how it would expire. So in this case, like I mentioned before, we can always go to the property. Now the DNSSEC option, if you've signed the zone previously in the wizard, you can right click it and choose sign zone. And we can have it where we would go through the wizard to set up the signing zone parameters and be able to complete the lab as instructed. So in the lab, it have you go to the signing options as part of the wizard, but if you didn't get to that options and if you click next, then what you can do is you can right click the actual zone and be able to choose the DNSSEC option and choose the signing options with the use default setting for the sign zone, which is the bottom option, and click next. So with that, what it will do is it will set up the DNS security extension, and you would proceed to the next part where you would complete the signing of the zone. So at this point, what you're doing is you're changing that zone from a regular DNS zone into a DNSSEC zone. And using the DNS manager, you will be able to see additional records that's going to pertain to the DNSSEC. How it's going to use SRA records and some of the signature in the signing of the DNSSEC. So compared to a regular DNS zone, the DNSSEC would have additional security where it would require specific authority and signing key in order for the management of the DNS or for the domain. Meaning that when the system joining the domain, it would have additional security requirement compared to a system that's joining a regular DNS. Now, for the following task, task 5, you have configured, when you install and configure the non-authoritative DNS on the BDM01, this is going to be setting up for the DNS server. So the next one, what you're going to do is you are going to go through using the lab BDC01, which is the server. So make sure that you select the right server. Then you are going to set up going into the Explorer and give access to advanced sharing. So in this case, what you're doing is you're sharing resources on the DNS. And in the DNS record, it stores to the DNS folder, and you're right-clicking the property of that folder to be able to set up how you wanted to share that resource. Remember that you have servers that are connecting to your main DNS, and in order to properly control permissions, we wanted to change the advanced sharing permissions to make sure we have proper access. So after we complete the advanced sharing option on the BDM01, then we are going to allow the trust with that folder. As part of the DNSSEC, what you're doing is when you're issuing key in order for security, it's gonna be storing the key under the DNS key folder as it would import that in. So when you establish the trust, you would need to make sure that that key is properly stored when it is imported. So when you import the key into the file, it would then put that file or the key into the DNS folder or directory, which is what you control with the shared permission earlier. So now, as we proceed, we would then create the trust point for our DNS secure folder. And what you're doing is you're setting it up on one server, and you are going to connect using the second server to be able to retrieve, as it would be part of the main, the primary server domain. And it needs to acquire that key, and with that key, it would be able to have established the security across one DNS with the sub DNS. So after we had set up on our servers, then we would go into our Windows 10. And on Windows 10, what we will do is we are going to use the PowerShell. And here we simply are going to access PowerShell. And PowerShell for Windows 10, you can enable PowerShell for if you have Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise. but you can incorporate PowerShell if you don't have any, those addition where you have to install the PowerShell. On the server environment, PowerShell comes equipped with Server 2019, so you can utilize the PowerShell with the server. It's designed for administration. So in Windows 10, what we will do is we would need to run as the administrator. And when you run as the administrator, you would have a higher privilege. So it shows you the screenshot on how to do that. Once it prompts you this and you click yes, then you are going to enter the PowerShell. Now, a little bit different than command prompt, PowerShell uses different type of command. So in this particular step, you are going to try to resolve the DNS name as you see there, and this is the zone that you had set up, and the trust anchor and the DNS key that you set up in the previous step for the server, and this is your server host name. What we're doing here is we're establishing a command that's going to detect the list of the key that's found inside that network or in that domain. And going back to the DNS folder where it stores the key, we had established the trust anchor to be able to utilize the key. So there are two trust anchor that's going to be given to you. One from the parent server, which is the BDC01. Second is from the lab DM01, which is the one that we had previously set up at the beginning. So now after that, what we will do is we would be able to look for a specific key or for our DNS key as it comes from the DNSSEC. So a little bit different than the regular DNS, your DNSSEC had this capability where it needs to have mutual trust between the client system and the server, and across two servers, when you have the parent server and the child server, what you would also have is established keys. So in step 1 for the query of the key, we are going to resolve the DNS name, which is going to refer to the host record. That would be securepracticelabs.com, and that is on the lab DM01, and we are going to check for the DNSSEC. Once you press enter with that command in PowerShell, you will resolve the DNS name for your system. So the result, it's going to show success if you enter everything correctly. So the challenge is if you don't type things in, if there's a typo, it's going to give you an error until you type it correctly. So make sure that you check how you type your command. Now, once we have resolved the DNS name, we wanted to validate the DNS by giving it the command get DNS client NPR policy. Now, that's going to take you to the DNSSEC validation. In Windows PowerShell, it's going to have you complete the next step where you would be setting up the group policy for your DNSSEC or your domain as you have signed it as a DNSSEC. So GPO represents the group policy object, and this allows us to control or set up rules for our DNSSEC with the validation process. So going back for this next step, you will need to go to lab BDC01 server. So make sure that you switch back to this server, and you are going to utilize the group policy management. So in the server environment, it has this management console that allows you to set up rules for the systems and the users and the object inside your Active Directory to be able to utilize or when they are accessing the domain to have the proper privileges and permissions that's required. So in the group policy management console, when you establish the domain, you would see it, the forest. The parent domain would be at the top, and if you have any additional sites or the child domains, it would be listed below in the domain sections. Okay. And what that will allow us to do is to be able to set up, like I mentioned, different type of policy object, so that way we can establish the rules across our hierarchical domain. So here in step 3, it tells you to create a new group policy object under the practice lab, and with that you will be able to edit it. So in order to create the rules, you first have to make a new GPO, and in that GPO you would need to edit and be able to manage the configuration. So now, as all GPO goes, you would start with computer configuration, go to policies, Windows policy, and in this particular case we are going to set up the group, the name resolution policy, in that how we want it to set up, how it should be resolving to the name based on the rules. So once we have established that, then in the create rules pane we would choose the suffix under the part of the namespace that you wanted to apply. So we would type in securepracticelab.com. So when the system is joining our domain, if they resolve by secure.practicelab.com, then it's going to be able to pinpoint the zone that we previously set up under the DNS. So not only that you have to set up the zone, but you have to set up what type of control you wanted to implement for that particular zone, and you would do that through group policy object. So group policy object allows you to control the zone once you have set it up. And so when the client system joining your domain, they need to be able to resolve by name, because it's gonna, in adding to the domain, a system simply can type in an address or simply can type in a domain name. And in this case, we want to make sure that they are able to connect using securepracticelab.com, but we also wanted to set up how the rules would be applied for those systems. So once we had gone through the group policy management editor, then we would also use PowerShell. And in PowerShell, we wanted to do GP update force. So anytime that you update or change GPO, group policy object, for anything in the server environment, you wanted to run GP update force, so that way you apply the changes in your group policy across the domains, from the parent to the child, or if you have multiple domains, it will update everybody. Okay, so in this case, we're going to update our practicelab.com, and we had set up the rules for secure practicelab.com. Now, in step 11, when you use your PowerShell, you issue get DNS client and NRPT policy. What that will do is it's gonna be able to obtain the rules that was set up for validation with the DNS. And in step 12, what we need to do is we need to locate the validation of the DNSSEC, and we wanted to make sure that the value is set to true to see that the rule is effective, or the policy we had set is effective. Now, after we have done that, then what we would need to do is we would go to our Windows 10. And for our Windows 10, we also wanted to do GP update force, so that way it would also update our client system. And then you can clear and check it again by using get DNS and RPT policy to see how the policy would carry from the server to the client system. So once you issue that command, you would see that the DNSSEC validation required field, it needs to be true because you have applied that rule on the server. You updated that. You updated Windows 10 with the rules that was changed on the server. So when you display the rule, it would say DNSSEC validation is required. Okay. Now, when you try to resolve the DNS name secure.practicelab.com from that server, what that will do is it's going to show the policy, and we are going to set up the trust. We're going to look at the trust anchor, use PowerShell, and to be able to resolve the name. So first we set it up on the main server on how we wanted to validate the trust with keys for any system that are connected, including Windows 10 and the second server that we are connecting. So when you're repeating the step for the last part of this exercise, you are using the server to validate, to check if there's validation with the resolution of securepracticelab.com when it's joining, okay, as part of the entire network. So you would see that in either the client system or the server system, the resource records, the RR, is going to be stored within the Secure Practice Lab zone, in which when we resolve the DNS name, we would need to refer to the SOA record that would be on the main server. So it would utilize that record to be able to resolve the name, in which what we would see with the host A, and that's going to tie that to the SOA records. So in order for any system to resolve the name from the client to the domain, what you would require is you would require a host name, but in the prior, you would need to resolve the name with the resource record by using the SOA on the main server. The exercise 2 is about configuring IPSec, and for IPSec, this is used for VPN. And in task 1, you are going to use Windows 10, And in Windows 10, you are going to utilize the Windows Defender, which is the Windows Defender firewall. So the beginning part, you are going to set up the rules for the firewall. Now it has you check the isolation, which allows you to control what's coming in and what's leaving, and how you wanted to isolate specific traffic. So after you click next, you are going to set up the authentication method, and Microsoft uses Kerberos, so we are going to use Kerberos v5. Then for step 6, the profile that you wanted to create would be, you would keep the domain private and public options as part of the profile. So that's going to be carried for your Windows firewall. The isolation policy is then applied. You're going to click finish, and your Windows Defender is going to update that policy once you have clicked finish. You can always change it by going into its property. So when we begin, what we wanted to do is we wanted to set up the client system firewall rules, because that system is going to be connecting to the virtual private network using IPSec. We wanted to establish an isolation policy, and virtual private network is used for remote systems. So in this case, now we would then click Remote Computers Lab to be correlated with the isolation policy property. Then we would add the IP addresses. We would then add this IP address, so that way that would be specifically for the remote system that we're using. Then we're going to click OK. So once you have the endpoint 1 added, then you're going to add another one for the endpoint 2, because it's going to go from one system connecting to another system. We're connecting from 192.168.0.3 over to this one. So there are two endpoints in the communication, the endpoint 1 and the endpoint 2. And we wanted to establish an isolated communication, and we would set that up with the rule for our firewall, so that way it would be able to evaluate the traffic on how the traffic would be coming in from a system and going out to the other system as endpoints. Then we would click OK. So the endpoint 1 would have a .3, the endpoint 2 would have a .1. So these two systems would be communicating directly, and they are under the isolation policy. So once we have established that, then we would connect to the server, the BDC01. We are going to start the administrative tools, and on the server itself, we would then also set up the firewall security setting. We would create also a new rule on the server. We would repeat similar process in such that we would have the isolation rule. So first you had set it up in the Windows 10 for the previous exercise, then you would move on to setting up the server. And on the server, we would set up the inbound and outbound authentication methods similar to what we've seen in the Windows 10 isolation policy. And we would also use the same options and also the IP address. So what you're doing is you're setting up your Windows 10 as one endpoint and the server as another endpoint. They both have to have the same rules in order to communicate. Okay. So you're going to see similar step for the server. Once that's done, you would click OK. And then the task 3 is for you to verify the security across the endpoint between Windows 10 and the server. So for BDC01, you would go into the Windows Firewall Advanced Security, click on Monitoring and Security Association in main mode. Then what you need to do next is you are to do a quick mode, and because for IPSec it's going to require the hash algorithm. So here is where you would set up secure hash algorithm 1, your SHA-1. Now when there's communication that's coming in, what's going to happen is we want to be able to have the security rule set up for outbound traffic and inbound traffic. So we wanted to request authentication for inbound and outbound using SHA. After that, we would observe the traffic. So we're going to use Microsoft Network Monitor application. And when you do this, what you will see is you would see the communication between the server and the Windows 10, in that it would have specific isolated traffic between the point 3, which is Windows 10, and the point 1, which is your server system. So similar to what you would see with other monitoring tools such as Wireshark, it will list the IP address from the source and the IP address from the destination. It will list the protocol. So when you're running the monitoring tool, you would see the list of traffic that's coming through between your Windows 10 and the server. Then after that, you would set up a network drive by mapping it to a folder. And the way that we would do this is we would be able to link a folder to a specific drive, so that way the user that's accessing the system remotely, they can simply click on the folder and they would be able to have access to a certain drive. So you would mount it with the drive. So once you map the drive to the folder, then you would be able to find that folder and be able to use resources from that folder. But as the system would do that, you would see that on the network traffic, where it would show how a system would connect to that drive or that folder to be able to access the resource. So for task 5 is going to allow you to use the network monitor, and you would filter the traffic. You're going to look for ESP. Earlier we had established ESP, so in this case we wanted to see how two systems communicate if there is traffic that would be ESP. So when you filter that on the monitoring tools, you will find the traffic that would be specifically for ESP, and you will be able to pinpoint how those two systems communicate. Okay, so here in the screenshot it shows you the details for the frame as it would be transferring for ESP next protocol with the frame detail. So as you go further, you will be able to evaluate the frame. Please make sure that you read the information that's provided to you in the explanation, how you will be able to filter, what kind of information that you are going to apply. Make sure that you do that accordingly. So when when you're looking at the network traffic, you can filter out specific traffic, and in this case, we're filtering out ESP, so we can check for IPSec traffic. Then we are going to try to disable the connection security rules between Windows 10 and the server. So we would disable the rule there. And then also on the server itself. Then we're going to try to monitor the traffic again and see if we will be able to determine the difference between when we disable the rule and how before when we apply the rule. So it's showing you how the changes is carried out after you disable the rule and be able to look at the traffic. And so when you map it to the network drive, how that rule is now no longer applied as you disable the rule on the firewall. So in the case where you would set up for the remote system to be accessing with the virtual private network, you first need to make sure that you would establish the rule between the client and the server. Once those needs to be set up with the firewall. Then in the middle, what we need to do as far as administration is to monitor network traffic to see if the rules are going to be applied, the isolation rule that will be applied for the virtual private network connectivity. Then we are going to test it by disabling the rule and monitor the traffic again to check. But in the real world scenario, you just establish the rule and mount the network drive so that way the user can access that network drive via the connection. But in the case where when we disable and refilter our network monitoring traffic is, we just wanted to see how that would be applied before and after. So in completion of exercise 2, you work with virtual private network. Then exercise 3, you would be working with email protocols. So it goes through and it gives you the explanation of what these protocols are. And so please look it over. Now in the last exercise, it doesn't really have you apply this to a certain email server or a specific server, but it's important to understand how the security protocol would be applied in the environment. So if you already have a DNS set up, you would then can set up an email exchange server, tie with the Active Directory, and you would be able to utilize the security protocol. So instead of using just FTP, we can use FTPS. Instead of using LDAP for our Active Directory, we can set up LDAP-PS. But keep in mind that in addition to that, we would operate over a certain additional security protocol, which require keys and how we would maintain that key and store that key, so that way the system would have trust in communication across. So you would look this over and see how each of these protocol is being explained for email, for web, for file transfer, for Active Directory services, your DNS, and even in communication as routing and switching. So as you get through the end, you can go ahead and complete by going through the summary. When you're done, give them a rating and then click done, and it will update your grade. Now you can close out your virtual machine, or you can simply power it off when you finish. And once you're done, make sure remember to click done, and that will end your lab. So thank you for watching this video. I wanted to briefly go over what you need to do. This lab is a little bit more lengthy than the previous lab, but it gives you a better understanding of how to work with the protocol.